The bitter December wind howled through the abandoned warehouse district, carrying flakes of snow that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. 12-year-old Tommy Evans huddled deeper into his threadbare coat, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He had been tracking the muffled cries for the past 10 minutes, following them to this derelict building with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. The sounds grew clearer, now a child's whimper, followed by a harsh adult voice. Tommy's heart pounded against his ribs as he crept closer, memories of his own past flooding back. Through a cracked window, he could make out the scene: a young girl, no more than 8, cowering in a corner while a large man loomed over her, belt in hand. Without thinking, Tommy burst through the rusted side door. "Hey," he shouted, his voice cracking with both fear and determination. "Leave her alone." The man whirled around, his face contorted with rage and surprise. "Mind your own business, street rat," he snarled, but Tommy could see the girl scrambling to her feet, seizing her chance. "Run," Tommy yelled to her, grabbing a piece of broken pipe from the ground. The man lunged forward, but Tommy stood his ground, remembering all the times he'd wished someone had stood up for him in the foster homes. What happened next was a blur of motion and pain. The girl escaped through the door, but the man's fury found a new target. Tommy felt the first blow across his shoulder, then another that sent him sprawling. His head cracked against the concrete floor, vision swimming with stars. Yet even as the kicks came, he smiled through bloodied lips, knowing the girl was safe. Then came the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. The man cursed, delivered one final savage kick to Tommy's ribs, and fled into the snowy night. Tommy lay there, each breath a sharp knife in his chest, watching snowflakes drift through the broken window above. As consciousness began to fade, he fumbled in his pocket for the worn photograph he always carried, his mother's smiling face looking back at him. "Did I do good?" Mummy whispered, a tear mixing with the blood on his cheek. "Did I make you proud?" As darkness claimed him, Tommy's last thought was of another winter night years ago when he too had been a frightened child, and how everything had changed since then. The story of how a homeless boy and a millionaire's paths would cross, of lost family and found truth, of pain and healing, it all began here, in the bitter cold of a December night, with one brave choice. Experience more heart-touching stories like this by subscribing. Each tale we share is carefully crafted to touch your soul and inspire hope. In the autumn of 2008, Sarah Evans worked part-time at a small coffee shop near Boston University, her determined spirit evident in the way she balanced her community college studies with long hours behind the counter. At 19, she had the kind of natural beauty that needed no embellishment: warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled and honey blonde hair, often tied back in a practical ponytail. Richard Hawthorne first walked into the coffee shop on a rainy October morning, his expensive suit slightly damp from the drizzle. Unlike the other business professionals who barely glanced at her, he looked directly into her eyes when ordering and thanked her by name. Something about his piercing blue eyes and the gentle way he spoke set him apart from his wealthy peers. What began as shy smiles and casual conversations over coffee gradually blossomed into something deeper. Richard found himself visiting the cafe more frequently, timing his visits to coincide with Sarah's shifts. Despite coming from vastly different worlds, he the heir to Hawthorne Industries, she the daughter of a high school teacher, they discovered a profound connection that transcended their social boundaries. Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant where Sarah felt uncomfortable about the prices until Richard insisted they split the bill, respecting her independence. She taught him about the simple pleasures of life, watching street musicians in the park, sharing hot dogs from a street vendor, laughing together on rickety carnival rides. He showed her art galleries and symphony halls, delighting more in her wonder than the exhibitions themselves. But their happiness was short-lived. When word reached Richard's father, James Hawthorne, the full force of family opposition crashed down upon them. James was a titan of old money and older prejudices, viewing Sarah as nothing more than a gold digger targeting his son's inheritance. He launched a subtle but devastating campaign against their relationship. First came the whispers in their social circles, suggesting Sarah was pregnant and trying to trap Richard. Then mysterious complaints appeared at her workplace, forcing her manager to reduce her hours. Anonymous tips to her college administration questioned her scholarship eligibility. Each attack was carefully orchestrated to appear unconnected to the Hawthorns. Richard fought against his father's interference, but James held the ultimate weapon: control over not just Richard's inheritance, but his entire future. "You'll be cut off," James threatened during a particularly heated argument. "No connections, no job prospects, no future. And make no mistake, I'll ensure she never finishes her degree either." Is that what you want for her? The pressure mounted until Richard faced an impossible choice: his love for Sarah Ward with the knowledge that defying his father would destroy not only his own future but hers as well. In a moment of weakness that would haunt him for years to come, he chose what he believed was the lesser evil. Their final meeting took place in the same coffee shop where they'd first met. "I don't love you anymore," Richard forced himself to say, each word feeling like glass in his throat. It was fun, but let's be realistic, we're from different worlds. He forced himself to watch as the light died in Sarah's eyes, knowing this performance had to be convincing for her own good. Sarah didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply removed the small promise ring he'd given her, placed it on the table between them, and walked away with dignity intact. Only Richard noticed her hands trembling as she pushed open the door one last time. What neither of them knew then was that Sarah carried a secret with her as she left, one that would change both their lives forever. In her womb grew the tiny spark of life that would become Tommy, a child born of love but destined to face the world without his father's name or protection. In the years following Richard's rejection, Sarah Evans faced her pregnancy with the same quiet determination that characterized her entire life. She left the coffee shop, unable to bear the memories it held, and found work as a waitress at a family diner where the owner, Ellen, took her under her wing. By her 7th month of pregnancy, she had saved enough to rent a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. Tommy was born on a spring morning, a healthy baby boy with his mother's warm brown eyes and his father's strong jaw. Sarah would often trace his features with a gentle finger, seeing echoes of Richard that brought both joy and pain. She never spoke ill of Tommy's father, choosing instead to tell her son that sometimes love wasn't enough to keep people together. During Tommy's early years, Sarah worked tirelessly to provide for her son. Days began before dawn, preparing Tommy's lunch for daycare before her morning shift at the diner. Evenings found her at a second job, cleaning offices while Tommy did homework in an empty conference room. Despite their financial struggles, she managed to create a home filled with love and laughter, turning cardboard boxes into castles and making adventures out of trips to the free museum on Sunday afternoons. Education remained Sarah's dream, not just for Tommy but for herself. She took online classes whenever possible, studying late into the night after Tommy was asleep. Her goal was to earn her degree in social work, hoping to help other single mothers navigate the challenges she understood so well. Each small achievement was celebrated with her son, teaching him that persistence and hard work could overcome any obstacle. The first signs of illness came: subtly unusual fatigue, unexplained bruises, persistent headaches. Sarah dismissed them as the natural result of her grueling schedule. Even when the symptoms worsened, she delayed seeking medical attention, worried about the cost and time away from work. It wasn't until she collapsed during her shift at the diner that she finally went to the emergency room. The diagnosis was devastating aggressive leukemia that had already progressed to an advanced stage. The doctors spoke of treatment options and survival rates, their voices becoming a distant buzz as Sarah's thoughts focused solely on Tommy. He was only 6 years old, too young to lose his mother, too young to understand why she couldn't play with him anymore. Through rounds of chemotherapy, Sarah maintained her brave face for Tommy's sake. She turned hospital visits into special mummy-son dates, bringing books to read together and making up stories about the magic medicine that would make her better. Ellen from the diner organized a rotation of staff members to help care for Tommy, bringing him to visit his mother and ensuring he never felt alone. As her condition deteriorated, Sarah began preparing for the inevitable. She wrote letters to Tommy, one for each birthday until his 18th year, filling them with motherly advice, memories, and all the love she couldn't express in person. She created a memory box with photos, special trinkets, and the story of how she met his father, not the bitter ending, but the beautiful beginning, wanting Tommy to know he was born from love. In her final weeks, when the pain became unbearable, Sarah's greatest comfort was holding Tommy close, breathing in his childhood scent and memorizing every detail of his face. She worried not about death itself, but about leaving her son alone in a world that had already shown him too little kindness. Her last coherent act was to write a letter to Richard, not of blame or anger, but of forgiveness and a mother's final plea for their son. Sarah Evans passed away on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Tommy's small hand clutched in hers. Her final words to him were both a blessing and a promise: "You are loved, Tommy. Always remember that. And someday, when you need me most, I'll find a way to help you, my brave, beautiful boy." Tommy's earliest memories were filled with the warmth of his mother's smile and the sound of her voice reading bedtime stories. Despite their modest circumstances, Sarah created a magical childhood for him. Their tiny apartment became an enchanted kingdom where blanket forts served as castles and paper planes carried their dreams to the stars. At school, Tommy showed the same quiet determination his mother possessed. His teachers noted his quick mind and eagerness to learn, though they also observed his tendency to withdraw during parent events or when other children spoke of their fathers. Sarah attended every school function she could, rearranging her work schedule and often going without sleep to be present for her son's important moments. The changes began subtly when Tommy was 6. He noticed his mother taking longer to climb the stairs to their apartment, sometimes pausing to catch her breath. The homemade cookies that once filled their kitchen became less frequent, replaced by store-bought snacks. Sarah's vibrant energy dimmed, though her love remained as strong as ever. When she first went to the hospital, Tommy stayed with Ellen from the diner, who tried to explain what was happening in terms a child could understand. "Your mummy's body is fighting a battle," she'd said, "like the knights in your storybooks." Tommy had nodded solemnly, believing with a child's certainty that his mother, his personal superhero, would surely win any battle. The hospital became a second home, its sterile corridors and antiseptic smell burning themselves into Tommy's memory. He watched as his mother grew thinner, her golden hair falling out, but her eyes never lost their loving warmth when they looked at him. Sarah transformed their hospital visits into adventures, teaching Tommy to make shadow puppets on the white walls and telling him stories about the warrior cells fighting the bad guys in her blood. As months passed, Tommy learned to read the worry in adults' faces, to understand the meaning behind whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He began hoarding memories like precious treasures, the feel of his mother's hand stroking his hair, the sound of her laugh, even the way she smiled through pain to reassure him. The final days came too quickly. Sarah, barely able to speak above a whisper, made Tommy promise to remember 3 things: that he was deeply loved, that being kind was more important than being successful, and that she would always watch over him. Tommy, wise beyond his 8 years, held her hand and promised, fighting back tears because he knew she needed to see him brave. On that last Tuesday, as winter light filtered through the hospital window, Sarah gathered her remaining strength. "Tommy," she whispered, "you are the best thing I ever did. Promise me you'll keep your heart open, no matter what happens. Love is always worth the risk." Those were her final words, spoken with her last breath, leaving Tommy with a legacy of love and an emptiness no child should have to bear. In the aftermath of Sarah's death, Tommy withdrew into himself, clutching the photograph of his mother that would become his most treasured possession. He didn't cry at the funeral, standing straight-backed as Ellen held his hand, watching as they lowered his whole world into the ground. It was only later, alone in their apartment for the last time, that he finally broke down, surrounded by the echoes of their shared life and the terrifying uncertainty of what would come next. Life on the streets taught Tommy lessons no child should have to learn. After escaping his last abusive foster home at age 11, he quickly discovered that survival required a complex set of skills that went far beyond what any classroom could teach. The city, once familiar and friendly through his mother's eyes, transformed into a harsh landscape of hidden dangers and rare opportunities. His first weeks were the hardest. Stumbling through the urban wilderness, Tommy learned through bitter experience which alleys were safe to sleep in, which dumpsters might yield edible food, and most importantly, which people to trust. The veterans of street life, other homeless individuals, became his unwitting teachers. He watched how they moved, where they gathered, and slowly began to understand the unwritten rules of his new world. Tommy developed a daily routine born of necessity. Dawn found him at St. Michael's Church, where Sister Margaret turned a blind eye as homeless youth used the bathroom to wash up. By 7, he would be outside Gino's pizzeria, helping the morning crew unload deliveries in exchange for leftover bread from the previous day. The library became his sanctuary during the hottest hours, its air conditioning and free water fountain a blessing he never took for granted. But it was more than just physical survival. Tommy carried his mother's photo everywhere, wrapped carefully in plastic to protect it from the elements. On the hardest nights, when hunger gnawed at his stomach and the cold seemed to seep into his bones, he would take out the picture and talk to it, telling his mother about his day, his fears, his small victories. Sometimes he swore he could feel her presence, guiding him away from the darker temptations of street life. He learned to read people with uncanny accuracy, a skill born of necessity. The slight shift in stance that preceded violence, the softening around the eyes that indicated genuine kindness, the forced smile of someone about to call the authorities, these subtle signs became his early warning system. Tommy developed what he called his invisible art, the ability to be present yet unseen, to blend into backgrounds and slip through crowds without drawing attention. Despite the harshness of his circumstances, Tommy never lost the moral compass his mother had instilled in him. He refused to steal, even when opportunity presented itself. Instead, he found creative ways to earn small amounts of money returning shopping carts for their deposits, helping elderly residents carry groceries, collecting recyclables before dawn. Each honest dollar earned felt like a tribute to his mother's memory. The street kids formed loose alliances, sharing information about safe sleeping spots and dangerous areas to avoid. Tommy became known among them for his reliability and fair dealings. He never took more than he needed and always shared what he could spare. This reputation served as a form of protection, earning him allies in a world where friendship could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Winter proved to be the cruelest season. Tommy learned to layer newspapers under his clothes for insulation, to stuff his shoes with plastic bags to keep out the wet, to find the heating vents that pumped warm air from buildings. He discovered that 24-hour laundromats could provide shelter on the coldest nights, as long as you kept a few quarters jingling in your pocket and didn't cause trouble. But perhaps the most valuable skill Tommy developed was maintaining hope. He never stopped believing in the possibility of a better future, even when reality seemed determined to crush that belief. He continued to read whenever he could get his hands on books, determined not to fall behind in his education. In quiet moments, he would work on math problems in his head, recite poems his mother had taught him, and dream of a day when he might return to school. Each night, before finding a place to sleep, Tommy would look up at the stars, the same stars his mother had once pointed out to him, and make the same promise, "I'm still here, Mom. I'm still trying. I'm still the person you raised me to be." This daily ritual became his anchor, a reminder that even in his darkest moments, he carried within him the strength of Sarah Evans' love and the dignity she had taught him to maintain, no matter the circumstances. The morning that would change Tommy's life forever began like any other. A bitter December wind whipped through the financial district as he huddled in his usual spot near the subway entrance. The early morning crowd rushed past, a blur of expensive coats and coffee cups, when a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. Richard Hawthorne emerged from the vehicle, every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and polished shoes. He was barking orders into his phone, his commanding presence causing people to instinctively step aside. Tommy watched him with mild interest, noting how different this man's world was from his own. The wind chose that moment to gust violently, sending papers swirling through the air. Richard reached to secure his tie, and in that instant his leather wallet slipped from his coat pocket, landing silently on the sidewalk. He continued toward the building, unaware of his loss, focused entirely on his phone conversation. Time seemed to slow as Tommy stared at the wallet, his stomach cramped with hunger he hadn't eaten in 2 days. That wallet likely contained enough money to keep him fed and warm for weeks. The street-smart part of him screamed to grab it and run. But his mother's voice echoed in his memory. Honesty, Tommy. It's what makes us who we are. Before he could second-guess himself, Tommy snatched up the wallet and called out, "Sir, you dropped this?" His voice cracked from disuse, but it carried enough to make Richard turn around. The businessman's face registered first surprise, then suspicion as he saw the scruffy boy holding his wallet. They locked eyes across the space between them, the millionaire and the homeless child, two worlds colliding on a cold city sidewalk. Richard slowly retraced his steps, studying Tommy with an intensity that made the boy want to shrink into himself. But Tommy stood his ground, arm outstretched, the wallet resting in his grimy palm. "You're returning this?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The question stung Tommy more than the cold. Even in his ragged state, even after everything life had thrown at him, his honesty was being questioned. "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "It fell when you were fixing your tie." He tried to ignore how his empty stomach twisted at the thought of the food money he was giving up. Richard took the wallet slowly, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Tommy's face. Something in those eyes shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his tone gentler now. "Tommy Evans," so the words were barely out of his mouth when Richard's face transformed. The composed businessman mask slipped, revealing a flash of shock, recognition, and something else, pain, perhaps. Color drained from Richard's face as he stared at Tommy as if seeing a ghost. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his wallet and withdrew a $100 bill. "For your honesty," he said, his voice rough with emotion Tommy couldn't understand. Tommy accepted the money with murmured bird thanks, already calculating how many meals it would buy. But as Richard turned to leave, he deliberately let something fall from his pocket, a photograph that landed face up on the concrete. Tommy bent to retrieve it, and his world tilted on its axis. There in the faded image was his mother, young and radiant, her arms wrapped around a younger version of the man who now stood before him. The same man who had walked away all those years ago, leaving Sarah Evans to face pregnancy and parenthood alone. Tommy's father. "Hey." The realization hit him like a physical blow, sending him staggering back a step. Richard was already disappearing through the revolving doors of his office building, leaving Tommy frozen on the sidewalk, the photograph burning in his hands like a brand. In that moment, standing between the world of wealth above and the streets below, Tommy felt the weight of destiny shifting. The $100 bill crumpled in his fist, and his mother's photograph seemed to press against his heart from its protected place in his pocket. Two images of Sarah Evans, one in each hand, bridging the vast gulf between the life he lived and the life that might have been. With trembling fingers, Tommy smoothed out the newly discovered photograph, his eyes tracing his mother's happy smile, the loving way she leaned into the man who would eventually break her heart. Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and walked toward the building's entrance. It was time to get some answers. Tommy's heart pounded as he approached the imposing glass doors of Hawthorne Tower. The security guard eyed him suspiciously, but Tommy spoke before he could be turned away. "I need to see Mr. Hawthorne. I have something important of his." He held up the photograph with shaking hands. The receptionist's initial dismissal faltered when she glimpsed the photo. Something in Tommy's desperate expression must have reached her because she made the call. "Mr. Hawthorne, there's a boy here." "Yes, the same one. He has something that belongs to you." The elevator ride to the top floor felt eternal. Tommy's reflection in the polished doors showed a boy he barely recognized. Gaunt face, two old eyes, clothes hanging in tatters. Yet beneath the street grime, his mother's features were unmistakable. He wondered if that's what had caused the flash of recognition in Richard's eyes. Richard's executive assistant led him into an office larger than any apartment Tommy had ever lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city below, the same streets where Tommy had scrounged for survival now reduced to miniature. Richard stood behind his massive desk, his composure restored but his knuckles white where they gripped the edge. "You dropped this too," Sir Tommy said, his voice steadier than he felt. He placed the photograph on the desk between them. "That's my mother." Sarah Evans. He watched Richard's face intently, seeing the mask of professional detachment crack. How Richard's voice faltered. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking older, vulnerable. "How did you know?" Tommy pulled out his own treasured photograph, protected in its plastic sleeve. "Because I carry her with me too." He laid it beside the other picture. The same smile, the same warm eyes, separated by years, but unmistakably Sarah. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the two photographs, his hand hovering over them as if afraid to touch either one. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I tried to find her years ago, but she was already dead." Tommy finished flatly. "Cancer." "I was 8. He didn't try to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Where were you when she was working 2 jobs to keep us fed? Where were you when she was sick? Where were you when she was sick? Where were you when they put me in foster care?" Richard flinched at each question as if they were physical blows. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, Tommy, I didn't know about you. If I had." You'd have what Tommy demanded, years of pain bubbling to the surface, swept in with your money and made everything better, like you did for her when she needed you. "I was a coward," Richard admitted, his carefully maintained facade crumbling entirely. "My father threatened to destroy her chances at college, at any kind of future. I thought I was protecting her by leaving. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Tommy laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Protecting her? She dropped out anyway. Had to, when she found out she was pregnant with your child. The child you never knew about, because you never bothered to check on her." Tears were flowing freely down Richard's face now. He pulled open a drawer and withdrew a battered shoebox. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to Sarah Evans, none of them sent. "I wrote to her every week for a year," he said softly. "But I never had the courage to mail them. By the time I finally looked for her..." It was too late, Tommy finished. He felt drained suddenly, the anger giving way to a bone-deep weariness. It was too late for a lot of things. They sat in silence, father and son separated by a desk and 16 years of absence. The two photographs of Sarah lay between them like a bridge and a barrier. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, dusting the city with white, covering its scars and secrets under a clean blanket. "I can't change the past," Richard finally said, "but if you'll let me, I'd like to try to make things right. Not just with money, but with time, with understanding, with..." He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the space between them. Tommy looked at his mother's photographs, one showing the happiness she'd once known, the other preserving the strength she'd shown in adversity. He thought about what she'd want, what she'd written in her final letter to him about keeping his heart open. "I don't need a father," he said carefully, watching Richard's face fall. "But maybe we can start by just talking. about her, about everything. The days following their initial confrontation took on a surreal quality for Tommy. Richard had insisted he stay in the penthouse's guest suite, a space larger than any apartment he'd shared with his mother. The soft bed and warm shower felt like alien luxuries after years on the streets, and he often found himself sleeping on the floor, more comfortable with hardness at his back. Richard's revelation about the past came in pieces, each one more painful than the last. They sat in his home office one evening, the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars, as he unveiled the full story of his relationship with Sarah and the forces that tore them apart. "Your grandfather, James Hawthorne, was a man who believed money could solve any problem or create them," Richard explained, pouring himself a drink with trembling hands. "When he learned about Sarah, he didn't see the brilliant, kind woman I loved. He saw a threat to his legacy, to his plans for me." Tommy listened as Richard described the systematic campaign of destruction his father had waged. The anonymous complaints that cost Sarah her jobs, the mysterious problems with her scholarship, the whispered rumors that followed her everywhere. "I thought by leaving, I was protecting her from worse," Richard said, his voice thick with regret. "I never imagined." That she was pregnant, Tommy finished, his voice flat. That she'd face it all alone anyway. He fingered the worn photograph in his pocket, his anchor in this strange new world. Richard nodded, unable to meet his son's eyes. "My father had investigators tracking her, making sure I didn't try to contact her, but they lost track of her when she moved to a different part of the city. By the time I finally broke free from his control, started looking for her myself." He trailed off, the guilt evident in every line of his face. "She was already sick," Tommy supplied, "working herself to death to give me a better life." The bitterness in his voice could have etched glass. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Finally, Richard reached into his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I found these," he said quietly, "after my father died last year. He'd kept them all this time." Inside were dozens of letters from Sarah to Richard, never delivered. The last one, dated just weeks before her death, made Tommy's hands shake as he read it. His mother's familiar handwriting, growing shakier toward the end, filled the pages with a final confession of forgiveness and a plea for Richard to find their son. "She never stopped loving you," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. "Even after everything she forgave you." The realization hit him like a physical blow, challenging years of accumulated anger and resentment. Richard's response was interrupted by the arrival of his executive assistant, carrying a file they'd been waiting for. The private investigator's report on Tommy's years in foster care made for grim reading. Richard's face grew paler with each page, each documented incident of neglect or abuse, each time the system had failed his son. "I should have been there," he said finally, his voice raw. "All those years, while I was building this empire, my own son was..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Tommy stood abruptly, moving to the window. His reflection overlaid the city lights, and for a moment he saw himself as others must, a street kid in borrowed clothes, out of place in this world of wealth and power. But then he caught a glimpse of something else in the glass, his mother's determination in the set of his jaw, her strength in his stance. "You can't change the past," he said finally, echoing his mother's words from her letter, "but you're here now. The question is, what happens next?" Richard joined him at the window, maintaining a careful distance. "Whatever you want to happen," he said softly, "I know I haven't earned the right to be your father, but I'd like the chance to try to get to know you, to help in whatever way you'll allow." Tommy considered this, thinking of his mother's final plea for him to keep his heart open. "I can't promise anything," he said slowly, "but maybe we can start with the truth. All of it. No more secrets." Richard nodded, relief and hope warring in his expression. "The truth," he agreed. No matter how difficult, neither of them realized then just how challenging that promise would prove to be, or how many more secrets still lay buried in the past. In the following days, Richard shared the full extent of his search for Sarah and Tommy through a series of painful revelations. In his home office, he unlocked a hidden safe behind an abstract painting and pulled out a thick leather portfolio that documented years of private investigations, dead ends, and heartbreak. After my father died, Richard explained, spreading the documents across his desk, I found evidence that he'd been actively sabotaging my attempts to find Sarah. Every lead I followed had been deliberately corrupted. He handed Tommy a stack of altered reports, each showing how information had been changed just enough to send investigators in the wrong direction. The most damning discovery came in the form of a small key found among James Hawthorne's personal effects. It opened a safety deposit box containing hundreds of letters, not just Sarah's undelivered messages to Richard, but also letters Richard had written to her. James had intercepted correspondence from both sides, ensuring their separation remained complete. He had a whole network, Richard said bitterly, showing Tommy documents revealing the extent of his father's interference. Private investigators, paid informants, even people inside the postal service, all to keep us apart. His hands trembled as he revealed monthly reports detailing Sarah's movements, her struggles, her illness, all information deliberately kept from him until it was too late. Among the papers was a hospital record from when Sarah was first diagnosed with cancer. She had listed Richard as Tommy's father, hoping the hospital would contact him. But James's influence reached even there. The records were altered, the contact attempt blocked. Tommy's hands clenched into fists as he read the notations in his grandfather's precise handwriting. Contact prevented, situation contained. The most heart-wrenching discovery was a small box containing items Sarah had tried to send to Richard over the years: sonogram photos of Tommy, his first baby picture, school photographs. Each item represented a moment Richard should have shared, a connection deliberately severed by his father's machinations. I hired the best private investigators, Richard continued, his voice rough with emotion, but every time they got close, something would happen. Records would disappear, witnesses would suddenly refuse to talk, leads would go cold. He showed Tommy expense reports and surveillance photos, evidence of years spent chasing shadows. One investigator's report from just months after Sarah's death came closest to finding Tommy. It included a photo of him entering a foster home, looking small and lost. Richard had been in Europe on business when the report arrived. By the time he returned, Tommy had been moved, and the trail had gone cold again. The investigators' subsequent reports suggested James Hawthorne's direct intervention in hiding Tommy's whereabouts. He was playing a long game, Richard explained, showing Tommy documents revealing his father's elaborate scheme. He wanted to ensure that even after his death, the truth would stay buried. He must have known the guilt would destroy me if I ever found out. The latest reports, dated just weeks before their chance encounter, showed how close Richard had come to finding Tommy on the streets. One photo showed him sleeping in the abandoned building he'd called home, clutching Sarah's photograph. Richard had to leave the room when he saw that image, overcome with the reality of his son's suffering. Among the papers was a letter James Hawthorne had written to Richard before his death, never sent, attempting to justify his actions. "Everything I did," he'd written, "was to protect our family's legacy. You'll understand someday when you have children of your own." The irony of those words made both Richard and Tommy fall silent. The most recent addition to the collection was a legal document Richard had prepared after finding Tommy papers acknowledging his paternity and making Tommy his legal heir. "I'm not showing you this to pressure you," he said quickly, seeing Tommy's expression. "I just want you to know that I'm committed to making things right, whatever that means to you." Tommy stared at the papers, overwhelmed by the weight of so much hidden history. Each document represented a moment when his life could have been different, when the trajectory of his fate might have changed. The enormity of what had been stolen from him, not just material comfort, but the possibility of a father's love, threatened to overwhelm him. "I need time," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "To process all of this." Richard nodded. understanding that the revelations of the past few hours had changed everything and nothing about their fragile new relationship. The initial weeks of Tommy and Richard's attempt at building a relationship were marked by awkward moments and hesitant steps forward. Neither seemed to know quite how to act around the other, Richard oscillating between desperate attempts to make up for lost time and careful distance, while Tommy struggled to reconcile the street-hardened survivor he'd become with the son Richard hoped to know. Their first shared meal in the penthouse dining room crystallized their differences. Tommy, accustomed to eating quickly and defensively, hunched over his plate while Richard watched with barely concealed distress. When Tommy automatically wrapped his unused bread in a napkin, a habit born from years of never knowing when his next meal would come, Richard had to excuse himself from the table, overcome with emotion. "I don't need your pity," Tommy had said sharply when Richard returned, his face still showing traces of tears. "I survived. That's what matters." Richard's response was quiet but firm. "It's not pity, Tommy. It's grief for all the moments I should have been there. And pride, yes. Pride that you survived, but you shouldn't have had to." They found safer ground in talking about Sarah. During evening conversations, Richard shared stories of their early romance, her laugh, her dreams, the way she could find joy in simple things. Tommy, in turn, described the mother he'd known, her strength, her sacrifice, her unwavering love. These shared memories of Sarah became a bridge between them, neutral territory where they could meet without the weight of their complicated present. Richard made efforts to understand Tommy's world, accompanying him to the homeless shelter where he'd sometimes found refuge. The sight of his expensive shoes picking through the same streets Tommy had survived on might have been comical if it wasn't so poignant. When Richard arranged for the shelter to receive a substantial anonymous donation, Tommy found himself torn between appreciation and a complex resentment that such help hadn't been available when he'd needed it most. They had their first real breakthrough during an unexpected moment. Tommy had been examining the view from the penthouse window when a sudden movement caught his eye, a peregrine falcon swooping past. His excited exclamation about the bird's speed and hunting patterns revealed a deep knowledge of urban wildlife, learned during his years on the streets. Richard, instead of showing pity or sadness at the reminder of Tommy's past, engaged him with genuine interest. They spent the next hour discussing the various birds Tommy had observed, Richard sharing his own amateur interest in bird watching. It was the first conversation they'd had that felt natural, unburdened by their history. Small gestures began to matter more than grand ones. When Richard noticed Tommy reading a worn paperback found in the penthouse library, he didn't make a show of buying him new books. Instead, he simply mentioned that the library was his too now, and Tommy was welcome to any volume that caught his interest. Tommy began leaving books he'd finished on Richard's desk, post-it notes marking passages he'd found meaningful. The hardest moments came when their different worlds collided. At a charity gala Richard was expected to attend, he carefully broached the subject of Tommy accompanying him. Tommy's response was immediate and fierce. "I won't be your redemption story. The poor street kid cleaned up and presented to society. I'm not ashamed of who I am or how I survived." Richard's response surprised him. "Good," he said simply. "You shouldn't be. I would never ask you to be anything other than who you are, Tommy. I want to share my life with you if you'll let me. But only when and if you're ready." Slowly, they began to establish their own rituals. Sunday mornings became their time for what Tommy jokingly called rich people breakfast, elaborate spreads ordered from Richard's favorite restaurant. During these meals, they gradually learned to talk about difficult subjects: Tommy's experiences in foster care, Richard's guilt, their shared grief over Sarah. One morning, about a month after their reunion, Tommy noticed Richard had stopped wearing his expensive wristwatch, replacing it with a simple digital model similar to the one Tommy had gotten from a shelter donation. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about Richard's willingness to meet Tommy on his own terms. "We're both trying," Tommy acknowledged that evening during their now routine talk before bed. "That's something, right?" Richard's smile was cautious but genuine. "It's everything," he replied. "They were baby steps, perhaps, but they were steps forward nonetheless." The transition from street life to luxury living proved more challenging than either Tommy or Richard had anticipated. The penthouse, despite its comforts, often felt like a gilded cage to Tommy. He would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced he needed to move locations for safety. The soft bed remained unused. He preferred sleeping on the floor, near a wall, old survival habits dying hard. Richard's attempts to help sometimes backfired spectacularly. When he surprised Tommy with a complete new wardrobe, the boy's reaction wasn't the gratitude he'd expected. Instead, Tommy exploded, "You can't just erase who I am by dressing me up. These clothes cost more than my mum made in a month." The designer items remained untouched in their bags, while Tommy continued wearing his familiar, worn clothing. Trust proved to be their biggest hurdle. Tommy struggled to believe that Richard's interest wouldn't eventually wane, that this wasn't some elaborate form of guilt assuagement that would end once Richard felt he'd done enough. Every act of kindness was met with skepticism, every attempt at fatherly affection analyzed for hidden motives. Their first major clash came when Richard discovered Tommy was still visiting his old haunts in the abandoned warehouse district. "It's dangerous there," Richard had argued, his fear manifesting as anger. "You don't need to go back to that life." "Those people are my family," Tommy shot back. "They looked out for me when no one else would." When you weren't there, the words hung between them like physical blows, both aware of the deeper wounds they represented. The incident led to their first real breakthrough. Instead of trying to forbid Tommy's visits, Richard asked to understand. Tommy reluctantly took him to meet Marcus, an elderly homeless veteran who had taught him vital survival skills, and Lisa, a teenage runaway who shared her food when Tommy had nothing. Richard saw firsthand the complex support network that had kept his son alive. The experience changed something in Richard. He began working with his company's charitable foundation to create better programs for homeless youth, consulting Tommy and his street friends for insight. It was the first time Tommy saw his father truly trying to understand his world rather than simply trying to pull him out of it. But old wounds continued to surface in unexpected ways. During a business dinner at the penthouse, one of Richard's colleagues made a dismissive comment about street rats. Before Richard could respond, Tommy calmly described his own experiences of survival, the intelligence and resilience required to live on the streets, and the humanity of those society often ignored. The businessman's embarrassment was palpable. But it was Richard's fierce pride in his son's composed advocacy that marked a turning point in their relationship. School presented another set of challenges. Despite his intelligence, Tommy's education had been severely disrupted. Richard hired tutors to help him catch up, but the process was frustrating. "I'm not stupid," Tommy would shout during particularly difficult sessions. "I learned different things that kept me alive." The breakthrough came when one tutor, Mrs. Henderson, recognized Tommy's practical mathematical skills developed from years of calculating survival needs. She adapted her teaching to build on these real-world experiences, helping Tommy see how his street smarts could translate to academic success. Trust issues manifested in smaller ways too. Tommy hoarded food in his room, unable to fully believe in the security of regular meals. He kept a packed bag hidden under his bed, ready to run if necessary. Richard pretended not to notice, understanding these were coping mechanisms his son wasn't ready to abandon. The media attention, when it inevitably came, nearly destroyed their fragile progress. Someone leaked the story of the homeless boy who turned out to be a millionaire's lost son. Reporters camped outside the building, spinning sensational stories about rags to riches and fairy tale endings. Tommy retreated into himself, while Richard fought to protect their privacy. The crisis reached its peak when a particularly aggressive reporter ambushed Tommy outside the building, shoving a microphone in his face and asking how it felt to hit the jackpot. Tommy's response, captured on camera, became a viral moment. "I didn't hit any jackpot. I lost my mother. I lost my childhood. I survived things no kid should have to face. Money doesn't fix that. Love might, but that takes more courage than most people have." The raw honesty of his words affected both father and son. That evening, they had their most honest conversation yet. "I'm trying," Richard admitted, "but I'm terrified of failing you again." "I'm scared too," Tommy confessed. "Scared to trust this, to trust you. Scared it'll all disappear like everything else in my life has." It wasn't an immediate fix, but naming their fears somehow made them more manageable. They began seeing a family therapist together, learning to navigate their complex relationship with professional help. Slowly they began to build something new, not a perfect father-son relationship, but something real, something honest. Through it all, Sarah's presence seemed to guide them. Her photograph watched over their attempts at connection, her memory serving as both motivation and standard. "Your mother would have handled this so much better," Richard said one evening after a particularly difficult day. Tommy smiled slightly, fingering the worn photo in his pocket. "Maybe," he said, "but she'd be proud we're trying. She always said trying was more important than getting it right the first time." The truth about James Hawthorne's final confession emerged during a rainy afternoon 6 months after Tommy and Richard's reunion. Richard's lawyer, Michael Bennett, arrived at the penthouse carrying a sealed envelope that had been held in trust to be delivered only after specific conditions were met. "Your father left instructions," Michael explained, his discomfort evident. "This was to be delivered only if you and Tommy ever found each other. He knew what he'd done would eventually come to light." Richard's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in James Hawthorne's precise handwriting, along with another envelope addressed to Sarah Evans, yellowed with age and never sent. Tommy stood by the window, his reflection ghost-like against the rain-streaked glass, as Richard began to read aloud. "My son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the truth I worked so hard to bury has finally surfaced. You found your boy, and with him, the weight of my sins." The letter detailed James's systematic campaign to separate Richard and Sarah, revealing an even deeper layer of manipulation than they'd known. James had not only intercepted their letters and sabotaged their attempts to connect, he'd actively monitored Sarah's pregnancy and Tommy's early years. He'd maintained a detailed file on his grandson, while ensuring Richard never discovered his existence. The most shocking revelation came halfway through the letter. "Sarah came to see me," Richard read, his voice cracking when she learned she was dying. "She begged me to tell you about Tommy, to give you the chance to know your son." I refused. Tommy made a small, wounded sound, but Richard continued reading. James described that final meeting in excruciating detail. Sarah, already ravaged by cancer but still beautiful, still strong, had come to his office carrying Tommy's photograph and birth certificate. She didn't ask for money or help for herself, only that James would ensure her son knew his father after she was gone. "I looked into her eyes," James wrote, "and saw the same love for her child that I claimed motivated my own actions. But where my love was selfish, controlling, hers was pure sacrifice. She knew she was dying, knew she was leaving Tommy alone, and her only thought was for his future happiness." The letter revealed that Sarah had left a package with James' letters she'd written to both Richard and Tommy, explaining everything, forgiving James for his interference, and expressing her hopes for their eventual reunion. James had kept these letters, along with all the others, locked away in his private safe. "I convinced myself." The letter continued that I was protecting our family's legacy. In reality, I was protecting my own pride, my own prejudices. It took watching Sarah walk out of my office that day, knowing she was walking to her death, to make me understand the magnitude of what I'd done. But by then, my pride wouldn't let me undo it. Richard had to pause several times while reading, overcome with emotion. Tommy remained by the window, his back turned, but his rigid posture betrayed his intense listening. The rain continued to fall outside, nature's own accompaniment to this unveiling of long-buried truths. The final pages contain James's deathbed confessions, the full extent of his manipulation, the networks of people he paid to maintain his web of deception, and most crucially, the location of Sarah's final letters. They were hidden in a concealed compartment in his study at the family estate, along with every piece of correspondence he'd intercepted over the years. "I don't ask for forgiveness," James concluded. "What I've done is beyond that. But I hope that in revealing the truth I can give you both the chance to build what I so ruthlessly destroyed." Sarah's final words to me were that love finds a way. Perhaps she was right. When Richard finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. Even the rain seemed to have paused. Tommy finally turned from the window, his face wet with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. He watched, Tommy said, his voice rough. He knew about me, knew Mum was dying, and he just watched. Why? Richard shook his head, his own tears falling freely. "Power," he said finally. "Control. The same things that drove everything he did. But Tommy, your mother, even at the end, she was trying to bring us together." Michael cleared his throat softly. "There's more," he said, producing a key. "The study at the estate hasn't been touched since James's death. Everything should still be there, exactly where he left it." Tommy and Richard exchanged looks. They both knew that behind that key lay not just Sarah's final letters, but the full record of their stolen years, every piece of correspondence, every photograph, every moment they should have shared. "We don't have to do this today," Richard offered, seeing the overwhelming emotion in his son's face. Tommy took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders in a way that painfully reminded Richard of Sarah. "Yes, we do," he said firmly. "Mum waited long enough for her letters to be read. We're not making her wait any longer." As they prepared to leave for the estate, the rain finally stopped. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a rainbow over the city, a sign, perhaps, that even the darkest secrets couldn't stay hidden forever, and that healing could begin only after the truth was fully revealed. The Hawthorne estate loomed before them, a Victorian mansion that seemed to hold its secrets close. As Richard unlocked the heavy front door, Tommy felt a shiver run down his spine. This was where his grandfather had orchestrated the separation of his parents, where his mother had made her final plea for him, where decades of deception had been carefully maintained. James Hawthorne's study remained exactly as he'd left it, leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive mahogany desk dominating the room, and an atmosphere of austere power that lingered even after his death. Richard moved directly to the wood paneling behind the desk, his fingers finding a hidden catch that revealed the concealed compartment his father had described. Inside, they found more than just Sarah's final letters. There was a small leather-bound book, Sarah's diary, kept during her pregnancy and Tommy's early years. Richard's hands shook as he lifted it out, along with a stack of photographs and letters that documented the life they should have shared. "She wrote this for you," Tommy said softly, recognizing his mother's handwriting. "She wanted you to know everything, even if she couldn't tell you herself." They settled into the study's leather chairs, and Richard began to read aloud from the diary's first entry. "Dear Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read these words, but I need to write them anyway. Today I found out I'm carrying your child, our child. Despite everything, I felt joy first. Pure, undiluted joy." The diary painted a vivid picture of Sarah's journey through pregnancy and early motherhood. Her excitement at first feeling Tommy kick, her determination to provide for him despite mounting difficulties, her unwavering love for both her child and his absent father. She documented Tommy's first steps, first words, the way his smile reminded her of Richard. One entry brought tears to both their eyes. Tommy asked about his daddy today. "I told him that sometimes love isn't enough to keep people together, but that he was born from love, real, true love. I hope someday he'll understand that both his parents loved him, even if one never knew he existed." The diary also revealed Sarah's struggles the nights she went hungry so Tommy could eat, the endless hours of work, the gradual realization that something was wrong with her health. Yet even in her darkest moments, her writing remained full of hope and love. "I see you in him more every day," she wrote. "He has your determination, your quick mind, your kindness hidden beneath a serious expression. Sometimes when he's thinking hard about something, he gets the same little wrinkle between his eyebrows that you used to get." Richard had to pause reading several times, overcome by the weight of these lost moments. Tommy sat silently, absorbing these new pieces of his mother, seeing himself through her eyes. The final entries were harder to read, written in an increasingly unsteady hand as her illness progressed. "I'm running out of time," she wrote. "But I want you both to know that I harbor no bitterness. Love doesn't die just because circumstances keep people apart. I've loved you both, my son and his father, every day of my life." The last entry was dated just days before her death. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means you found our boy. Please help him understand that life's greatest tragedy isn't death, it's letting fear keep us from love. And Tommy, my brave, beautiful son, remember that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the strongest choice you can make. Let love guide you both back to each other." Tucked into the final pages were items Sarah had saved: Tommy's hospital bracelet from his birth, a lock of his baby hair, the first flower he had ever picked for her pressed between the pages. Each item was carefully labeled with a note explaining its significance, creating a bridge across time to the moments they'd lost. "She never gave up hope," Richard said softly, touching the pressed flower. "Even at the end, she believed we'd find each other." Tommy reached for the diary, handling it with reverence. "She knew you better than you knew yourself," he said. "Listen to this part. Richard's father may think he's won, keeping us apart. But love finds ways to cross the barriers we build. Someday, Richard will break free of his father's control, and when he does, he'll move heaven and earth to make things right." The prophecy in those words struck them both. Here they were, years later, exactly as Sarah had predicted, father and son reunited, trying to rebuild what had been broken. As the afternoon light faded, they continued reading, neither willing to stop until they'd absorbed every word Sarah had left them. The diary became more than just a record of the past, it was a guide for their future, filled with Sarah's wisdom and unconditional love. "There's one more thing," Richard said finally, reaching into the compartment. He withdrew a sealed envelope, Sarah's final letter, written on her last day. "Are you ready for this?" Tommy nodded, though his heart was pounding. Together, they broke the seal, preparing to read Sarah's last words, words that would change their understanding of everything that had happened and illuminate the path forward they needed to take. The study had grown dark, but neither moved to turn on the lights. In the gathering dusk, Sarah's presence seemed to fill the room, her love reaching across time through the pages of her diary, bridging the gulf between father and son with the power of her enduring hope and forgiveness. The catalyst for their biggest conflict came 3 months after discovering Sarah's diary. Tommy had been helping at a homeless shelter when he overheard volunteers discussing a development project that would demolish the building and displace dozens of homeless individuals. The company behind the project, Hawthorne Industries. When Tommy burst into Richard's office that evening, his face was flushed with anger. "Were you going to tell me," he demanded, throwing down the development plans he'd obtained, "or did you think I wouldn't find out that you're destroying the only home some of these people have?" Richard looked up from his computer, his expression guarded. "It's a complicated situation, Tommy. The shelter building is unsafe, beyond repair. We're building a modern complex that will benefit the entire community." Benefit? Tommy's laugh was bitter. "I lived on those streets, Dad. I know those people. Where are they supposed to go?" "Did you even think about that?" The word Dad came out like an accusation rather than a term of endearment. "Of course I did," Richard defended, but Tommy cut him off. "Like you thought about Mum? About me? Is this how you justify everything, by telling yourself it's for the greater good?" The words hit their mark. Richard flinched visibly. The argument escalated quickly. Tommy revealed that Marcus, the veteran who had protected him on the streets, would be among those displaced. Richard countered with statistics about property values and urban development. But beneath their words lay deeper wounds: Tommy's lingering resentment over his years of hardship, Richard's guilt-driven attempt to prove himself a worthy father. "You can't just throw money at problems and expect them to disappear," Tommy shouted. "These are real people with real lives. Just because they're homeless doesn't mean they don't matter." "I know they matter," Richard shot back, "but I have responsibilities to my shareholders, to the city, to everyone except the people who actually need help," Tommy finished coldly. "You know what? Maybe your father was right about one thing: money does change people. It makes them forget what it's like to struggle." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went pale, and Tommy immediately regretted his words but couldn't take them back. The ghost of James Hawthorne seemed to loom between them, threatening to undo months of careful relationship building. Richard sank into his chair, suddenly looking old and tired. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've become exactly what I never wanted to be: someone who values profits over people." He picked up Sarah's photograph from his desk, touching it gently. "Your mother would be ashamed of me." Tommy's anger deflated slightly. "She wouldn't be ashamed," he said, disappointed maybe. "She always believed people could do better if given the chance." That evening marked a turning point. Instead of pushing forward with the original plans, Richard invited Tommy to help redesign the project. They spent weeks meeting with community members, shelter residents, and social workers, creating a new vision that would serve both business interests and human needs. The revised plan included affordable housing units, a modern shelter facility, job training programs, and support services, all integrated into the new development. Richard used his business acumen not to displace the homeless population, but to create opportunities for them. "This is what Mom meant," Tommy said one evening, as they reviewed the final plans. "About love finding a way to cross barriers. Sometimes the barriers are just in our minds, like thinking business success and social responsibility can't coexist." Richard nodded, studying his son's face, so like Sarah's when she was passionate about something. "She always saw possibilities where others saw problems," he said. "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." The conflict had forced them both to confront uncomfortable truths. For Tommy, it meant acknowledging that change sometimes required working within the system rather than fighting against it. For Richard, it meant recognizing that his pursuit of success had led him to compromise the values Sarah had loved in him. Together, they found a middle ground, one that honored both Sarah's compassion and the practical realities of business. The new development would become a model for socially responsible urban renewal, proving that profit and purpose could coexist. As construction began, with Marcus and other community members employed as consultants, Tommy watched his father address the media. Richard spoke not of property values or investment returns, but of community, responsibility, and second chances. Maybe Tommy thought, this is what healing looks like: not forgetting the past, but using its lessons to build a better future. Sarah would have understood that. She had always believed in the power of love to transform not just hearts, but the world itself. The identity crisis hit Tommy unexpectedly during a high-profile charity gala at the Hawthorne mansion. Dressed in an expensive suit that felt like a costume, he stood at the periphery of the glittering crowd, acutely aware of the contrast between his past and present lives. The overhead crystal chandeliers cast shadows that reminded him of the flickering streetlights under which he'd once sought shelter. A conversation fragment drifted his way. "Oh yes, Richard Hawthorne's son, the one from the streets." Such an inspiring story. The words, though meant kindly, cut deep. Was that all he was now? A redemption narrative for the wealthy to feel good about. The crisis deepened when he overheard a business associate of Richard's discussing him in the library. "Remarkable how well he's adapted to civilized society. You'd hardly know his background." The casual condescension sparked a rage that Tommy had thought long buried. That night, after the guests had gone, Tommy disappeared. Not to the streets this time, but to his mother's grave, where he sat until dawn, wrestling with questions of identity. "Who am I now, Mom?" he whispered to the cold marble. "The street kid," The heir? Your son? His son? I don't know how to be all these things at once. When Richard found him there, Tommy was clutching Sarah's photograph, tears freezing on his cheeks in the pre-dawn chill. I don't belong anywhere anymore, he confessed. I'm too street for your world, too privileged now for my old one. Even my memories of Mum feel different, like they're being rewritten by all this wealth. Richard sat beside him on the frozen ground, expensive suit be damned. Your mother, he said carefully, once told me that belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about being true to yourself and finding people who love you for who you are, not what you are. The crisis manifested in unexpected ways. Tommy began spending more time in his old haunts, not hiding his expensive clothes but not flaunting them either. He brought food and supplies to his street friends, but also sat with them, sharing their stories, bridging his two worlds. At school, he refused to hide his past. When classmates made ignorant comments about homeless people, he educated them with quiet authority. I lived it, he would say simply. Let me tell you what it's really like. Some backed away, uncomfortable with his honesty. Others, surprisingly, drew closer, drawn to his authenticity in a world of careful facades. The turning point came during a school presentation about personal heritage. Instead of focusing on the Hawthorne legacy, Tommy spoke about his mother, a waitress who taught him dignity, street friends who showed him loyalty, and yes, a father who proved it's never too late to rebuild broken bridges. I am all of my experiences, he declared to the stunned classroom. The hungry nights taught me gratitude. The loneliness taught me compassion. The struggles taught me strength. I won't reject any part of myself to make others comfortable. Richard, sitting in the back of the classroom, felt tears spring to his eyes. In that moment, Tommy looked so much like Sarah, the same fierce pride, the same unwavering authenticity. He recognized that his son's struggle wasn't really about belonging, it was about claiming the right to be his whole, complex self. The crisis evolved into a transformation. Tommy began working with Richard to create programs that would bridge the gap between privileged and disadvantaged youth. He used his unique perspective to challenge assumptions on both sides, becoming not a symbol of rags to riches success, but a translator between worlds that rarely understood each other. At home, he stopped trying to fit into either extreme. His room became a reflection of his dual identity, expensive electronics alongside treasured street art, classic books sharing space with survival gear he couldn't bring himself to discard. Richard, watching his son navigate this integration, realized that Tommy wasn't just finding his place, he was creating a new one entirely. Your mother would be proud, Richard said one evening, finding Tommy teaching one of his wealthy classmates about the intricate social networks that help street kids survive. Not because you've succeeded in either world, but because you've refused to let either one define you completely. Tommy smiled, fingering the worn photograph in his pocket, his touchstone between worlds. She always said that real strength isn't in becoming what others want you to be, he replied. It's in becoming who you truly are, even if that person doesn't fit into any easy category. The crisis didn't end neatly, identity rarely does, but Tommy gradually found peace in his complexity. He learned to move fluidly between his different roles: son of privilege, advocate for the homeless, bridge between communities, keeper of his mother's legacy. In embracing all aspects of himself, Tommy discovered something profound. True belonging isn't found in fitting perfectly into any one world, but in being true to every part of your story. His crisis of identity became a gift, allowing him to help others struggling with their own questions of belonging and authenticity. As he wrote in his journal one night, Mom always said love finds a way. Maybe that includes learning to love all the different pieces of yourself, even when they don't seem to fit together. Maybe that's the greatest belonging of all. The confrontation with the extended Hawthorne family erupted during the annual family gathering at the estate. The event, traditionally a celebration of wealth and privilege, became a battlefield when Richard officially announced his intention to make Tommy his heir. Richard's sister Victoria, who had expected her own son to inherit the bulk of the family fortune, led the opposition. This is preposterous, she declared. her voice carrying across the formal dining room. A street urchin cannot possibly be prepared to handle the Hawthorne legacy. Think of what father would say. Tommy, standing quietly beside Richard, felt every eye in the room examining him, judging the cut of his suit, his posture, searching for signs of his humble origins. But years on the street had taught him to stand firm under hostile scrutiny. Father was wrong about many things, Richard responded calmly. His prejudices cost this family 16 years with my son. I won't let them cost us any more. Victoria's husband, Charles, a corporate lawyer, stepped forward with a thick folder. We've done some investigating, he announced, spreading documents across the dining table. Police reports of suspicious activity in areas where he was known to frequent, associations with known criminals. Is this really who you want representing the Hawthorne name? The accusations hit their mark not with Richard but with Tommy. These were people he had known, helped, been helped by. Some had stolen to eat, traded illegal goods to survive, but they had also shared their food when he was starving, watched his back when he slept. Those criminals you're talking about, Tommy spoke for the first time, his voice steady. They showed more humanity than I've seen in this room tonight. They shared what little they had, while you sit here worried about your inheritance. Richard's cousin Margaret gasped dramatically. Did you hear how he spoke to us? No respect for his betters at all. Betters? Richard's laugh was harsh. My son survived challenges that would break any of us. He maintained his integrity in circumstances we can't imagine. Tell me, Margaret, what exactly makes you his better? The tension in the room was electric. Victoria's son, Bradford, who had been quietly seething, suddenly burst out. He'll destroy everything this family has built. He's probably just waiting to get his hands on the money and run. Before Richard could respond, Tommy pulled out his mother's photograph, not the one from his pocket, but the one they'd found in Richard's wallet that fateful day. You want to know about family? He asked, his voice carrying clearly. This woman worked 2 jobs while fighting cancer, never asked for help, never lost her dignity. She taught me that real family isn't about money or status, it's about love, loyalty, and standing by each other when things get tough. The silence that followed was deafening. Several family members shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Tommy's steady gaze. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, facing his relatives with quiet determination. Sarah Evans had more class, more grace, and more strength than this entire room combined, Richard declared. Our son is heir to both her legacy and mine. If any of you have a problem with that, the door is right there. Victoria made one last attempt. The board of directors will never accept this. Think of the shareholders, the company image. Richard's smile was cold. The board has already been informed. They've seen Tommy's work with the homeless outreach program, his ideas for socially responsible development. They're quite impressed with his unique perspective on community investment. The confrontation marked a turning point. Some family members stormed out, muttering about lawyers and challenges. Others, surprisingly, approached Tommy later, curious about his experiences and ideas. A few even apologized for their initial judgment. As the evening wound down, Richard found Tommy in James Hawthorne's old study, looking at the family portraits on the wall. I'm sorry you had to face that, Richard said quietly. Tommy shook his head. Don't be. Mom always said that how people treat you says more about them than about you. He touched the photograph in his pocket, his talisman, his connection to Sarah's strength. Besides, we faced worse than a room full of angry rich people, haven't we? Richard smiled, recognizing the steel in his son's voice, the same strength that had helped him survive the streets, that had led him to return a stolen wallet, that had allowed him to open his heart to a father who had been absent for so long. Your mother would have loved seeing you stand up to them, Richard said. She never let anyone make her feel small either. Together, they looked out the study window at the gathering dusk. The Hawthorne estate stretched before them, its manicured lawns and careful landscaping a symbol of the privilege Tommy had entered. But it was his experiences on the streets, his mother's lessons in dignity and compassion, that would truly shape how he used that privilege. The confrontation with the family had been inevitable, a necessary battle in their ongoing journey. In standing their ground together, father and son had declared not just their legal connection, but their shared commitment to changing what the Hawthorne name would mean for future generations. The discovery came in an innocuous manila envelope, delivered to Richard's office by a retiring social worker who had recently found it while cleaning out old files. Inside were documents that would shake both Tommy and Richard to their core paperwork for an adoption that never happened. As they sat in Richard's office reviewing the documents, the tragic story unfolded. 6 months after Sarah's death, when Tommy was 8, a couple named David and Marie Anderson had wanted to adopt him. They were teachers, kind and stable, with a small house in a good neighborhood. More importantly, they had known Sarah Marie had been a regular at the diner where she worked. "I remember them," Tommy whispered, his hands trembling as he held their photograph. "They used to bring me books when they visited the foster home. Mrs. Anderson taught me to play chess." His voice cracked. "Then they just stopped coming." The rest of the documents revealed why. The Andersons' application had been perfect, their home study exemplary. Tommy had even started weekend visits with them, the first steps toward permanent placement. But then something had gone wrong. "No," Richard breathed, his face ashen as he read further. "No, no, no." His hands shook as he reached the crucial document, a letter from Hawthorne Industries' legal department to the adoption agency, expressing concerns about the Andersons' financial stability. The irony was brutal. Richard's own company, acting on standard procedures for vetting potential adoptive parents in cases where they had teaching contracts with Hawthorne-funded schools, had flagged the Andersons as a financial risk. The adoption agency, not wanting to challenge a powerful corporation, had quietly steered them toward another child. "They were going to be my family," Tommy said quietly, his voice hollow. "I would have had a home, gone to school, had a normal life. But your company, He couldn't finish the sentence. Richard felt physically ill. "I didn't know," he whispered. "The legal department handles thousands of background checks. I never saw. I never knew," but the excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. His company, his responsibility. The documents showed more. The Andersons had fought for Tommy, trying to challenge the assessment, but going up against Hawthorne Industries' legal team had cost them their savings. Eventually, heartbroken, they'd had to withdraw their application. Tommy got up abruptly, moving to the window. The city sprawled below, indifferent to the pain unfolding above. "All those years in foster homes," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "All the abuse, the running away, living on the streets. It could have been different." Richard stood helplessly, wanting to comfort his son, but knowing he had no right. His own company had robbed Tommy of a chance at happiness, at a normal childhood. The weight of this unintentional cruelty, added to his other failures as a father, felt crushing. "I want to find them," Tommy said suddenly, turning back to face Richard. "The Andersons. I need to know." He trailed off, but Richard understood. Tommy needed to know if they had thought of him, if they had truly wanted him, if they had fought for him as hard as the documents suggested. "We'll find them," Richard promised, already reaching for his phone. But Tommy stopped him. "No," he said firmly. "No private investigators, no corporate resources. I need to do this my way. They deserve better than what your company did to them. They deserve better now." The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Richard's wealth and power, which he now wanted to use to make amends, had been the very thing that had destroyed Tommy's chance at a family years ago. As Tommy left the office, clutching the Andersons' old photograph, Richard watched him go with a heart heavy with fresh guilt. He had told himself that he couldn't change the past, only make the future better. But now he understood that the past wasn't just about his personal failures, it was about a system he had helped create, one that valued financial metrics over human hearts. In his pocket, Tommy touched his mother's photograph, his anchor in emotional storms. "I would have never forgotten you," he whispered to Sarah's image. "Even with them, I would have kept you in my heart." Somehow he felt she would have understood. After all, she had taught him that love wasn't about possession, but about wanting the best for those you care about. The revelation of Hawthorne Industries' role in Tommy's lost adoption opportunity sent ripples through the company that grew into waves. Richard, driven by a mixture of guilt and determination, began digging deeper into his company's past practices. What he found left him devastated. The legal department's intervention in Tommy's adoption hadn't been an isolated incident. Over the years, Hawthorne Industries' stringent financial background checks had affected numerous adoptions, all under the guise of protecting educational standards in schools affiliated with the company. Richard discovered a pattern of unconscious cruelty masked as corporate due diligence. Teachers, social workers, and other modestly paid professionals had regularly been flagged as financial risks. When seeking to adopt, their applications quietly undermined by corporate assessments that valued bank balances over human potential. "Look at these numbers," Richard said one evening, spreading documents across his home office desk. Hundreds of potential adoptions affected. All these children, all these families. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of distress Tommy had come to recognize. Tommy picked up one of the files, reading about a nurse who had wanted to adopt siblings but was deemed financially unsuitable. "They probably thought they were doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Protecting children from potential poverty. They just didn't understand that love and stability matter more than money." The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Richard's wealth, which now allowed him to provide Tommy with every material comfort, had been built on policies that had denied other children the chance at loving homes. The very success he had achieved while absent from Tommy's life had contributed to the system that had failed his son. The investigation revealed more. Hawthorne Industries' influence extended beyond adoptions. Their real estate developments had repeatedly displaced low-income families. Their corporate policies had made it difficult for employees to balance work and family life, and their financial requirements had created barriers for small businesses trying to compete for contracts. "It's like a web," Richard said, staring at the evidence of his company's impact. "Every decision, every policy had consequences we never considered. While I was focusing on profits and growth, real people were being hurt." Tommy watched his father grapple with this reality, seeing the genuine anguish in his face. "You can't change what happened," he said, echoing words often spoken between them. "But you can change what happens next." The comment sparked something in Richard. He began working on a comprehensive overhaul of company policies, starting with the creation of the Sarah Evans Initiative, a program specifically designed to support adoptions by qualified candidates, regardless of their income level. But the changes didn't stop there. Richard established a review board that included Tommy and other individuals with direct experience of the system's failures. They began examining every aspect of corporate policy through the lens of human impact, rather than just financial metrics. The process wasn't smooth. Shareholders questioned the changes, executives resisted the new direction, and the legal department warned about potential risks. But Richard stood firm, supported by Tommy's first-hand understanding of how corporate policies affected real lives. But "I keep thinking about the Andersons," Tommy admitted during one particularly challenging meeting. "They were exactly the kind of parents a child needs: caring, committed, willing to fight for their kid. But our system only saw their bank account." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Richard's shoulders. Each new discovery of past harm made him question everything he'd built, everything he'd been proud of. The empire he'd created while absent from Tommy's life had actively contributed to his son's suffering. "Your mother would have seen through it all," Richard said one night, looking at Sarah's photograph. "She always understood what really mattered. While I was building this company, she was building something far more important. She was raising a son who understood the difference between wealth and worth." Tommy touched his own copy of Sarah's photograph, a gesture that had become almost unconscious. "She used to say that mistakes don't define you, it's what you do after you realize you've made them that matters." As father and son worked together to reshape Hawthorne Industries, they began to understand that their personal journey of reconciliation was intertwined with a larger mission of corporate redemption. The company that had inadvertently caused so much pain could become a force for positive change, but only if they were willing to acknowledge its past failures and commit to a new way forward. The emotional breakdown came unexpectedly, weeks after discovering the Andersons' story. Tommy had been helping to review more corporate files when he found a photograph of himself at 8 years old, attached to the adoption agency's original paperwork. The sight of his younger self, thin, scared, but still holding on to hope, shattered the emotional walls he'd carefully built. "I did everything right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was polite, I kept my room clean, I got good grades. I thought if I was perfect enough, someone would want me." The photograph trembled in his hands. But it didn't matter. Nothing I did mattered. Richard, witnessing his son's pain, moved to comfort him, but Tommy jerked away. Years of suppressed emotion erupted like a volcano. "Don't touch me," he shouted. "You don't get to comfort me about this. Your company, your money, your precious reputation, it all worked together to keep me alone." The breakdown had been building for months, perhaps years. Every discovery about the past, every revelation about how close he'd come to having a different life, had added another crack to Tommy's carefully maintained composure. Now, everything was spilling out at once. "I used to dream about them, Tommy continued, pacing the office like a caged animal. "And the Andersons. I didn't know why they stopped coming, so I made up stories. Maybe they had an accident. Maybe they moved away. I never imagined it was because some corporate algorithm decided they weren't good enough." Richard stood helplessly, watching his son unravel. Every word was a justified accusation, every tear a testament to his company's cold efficiency, valuing profits over people. "Tommy, please." Please what? Tommy rounded on him. "Please forgive you? Please understand. Do you understand what it's like to sleep in abandoned buildings at 11 years old? To dig through dumpsters for food? To wonder every single day what you did wrong to make everyone leave you?" The photograph fluttered to the floor as Tommy's legs gave out. He slid down the wall, wrapping his arms around his knees like he used to do in foster homes when things got too overwhelming. "Mom died thinking I'd be taken care of," he sobbed. "She trusted the system, and the system was rigged against kids like me from the start." Richard knelt beside his son, not touching, just present. "You're right," he said quietly. "About all of it. I built a company that hurt people hurt you, and no amount of money or privilege now can undo that damage." Tommy pulled out his mother's photograph, so worn now the edges were soft. "She used to tell me that everything happens for a reason," he said, his voice hollow. "But what possible reason could there be for all of this? What good came from any of it?" They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of past trauma filling the room. Finally, Tommy spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "The worst part is, I still love them. The Andersons, I barely remember them, but I love them for trying, for wanting me when no one else did." Richard watched his son struggle with emotions too big for any heart to hold. The businessman in him wanted to fix things, to throw money at the problem until it went away. But the father in him knew that some wounds needed more than money to heal. "Maybe," Richard suggested gently, "it's time we both stopped trying to make sense of the past and focused on healing instead. Not just ourselves, but all the others who've been hurt by systems we created or maintained." Tommy looked up, his face tear-streaked but his eyes clearing slightly. "Mom would want that," he said. "She always said that helping others was the best way to heal yourself." As the evening light faded from the office windows, father and son sat together in the aftermath of emotional storm. The photograph of 8-year-old Tommy lay between them, a reminder of all that had been lost, but also, perhaps, a guide to what needed to be fixed. "We can't change what happened," Tommy said finally, echoing words they'd both said many times before. "But maybe we can change what happens next. For other kids. Other families." It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was a step toward something new. something that might eventually help them both find peace with the past they couldn't change and the future they could help shape. The revelation that would change everything came wrapped in a faded blue envelope discovered in the back of James Hawthorne's personal safe during a final clearing of his estate. Sarah's last letter, written days before her death, had never reached its intended recipient until now. Richard's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, Tommy standing beside him in the study that had once been the command center of their separation. The paper inside was hospital stationery, the handwriting shaky but determined Sarah's final message to the man she had loved. "Dear Richard," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then time has finally bridged the gap between us, though I won't be here to see it. I'm writing not to burden you with guilt or regret, but to free you from them." Tommy watched his father's face as he read, seeing emotions play across it like shadows. Sarah's words flowed across the pages, telling a story neither of them had known. "I discovered the truth about your father's manipulation years ago," she wrote. "A nurse here, whose sister worked at Hawthorne Industries, told me everything: how James threatened you, how he intercepted our letters, how he orchestrated our separation. I want you to know that I understood, and I forgave you long ago." Richard had to pause, overcome. Tommy placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, encouraging him to continue. "Our son, Tommy, is the best of both of us," Sarah's letter continued. "He has your determination, your sharp mind, and thankfully my common sense." Here, both men smiled through their tears. "I've tried to teach him that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being true. True to yourself, true to others, true to what matters most." The letter revealed that Sarah had written to James Hawthorne as well, not in anger but in hope. She had appealed to him to reveal the truth to Richard after her death, to give father and son a chance to find each other. Even if he refused, she wrote, "I believed love would find a way. It always does." I don't write this to absolve anyone of responsibility. But Sarah's words continued, but to offer understanding. "Richard, your father's actions were his own, not yours. The choice he forced on you was impossible: sacrifice your love or destroy my future. You chose what you thought would give me the best chance, and though it brought us all pain, I recognize the love behind that choice." The most stunning revelation came near the end. Sarah described how, in her final weeks, she had arranged for a series of letters and photographs to be hidden throughout the places that had mattered in their story: the diner where they met, the park where they fell in love, the church where they had planned to marry. Each contained pieces of their story meant to be found if Tommy and Richard ever reconnected. "Consider it my final gift to you both," she wrote, "a treasure hunt of sorts, leading you through our past to help build your future, because that's what matters now, not the years lost, but the ones ahead." The letter concluded with words that would forever change how both men viewed their journey. Love isn't just about happy endings. Sometimes it's about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about finding the courage to begin again. Richard, be the father I know you can be. Tommy, be the man I've always seen in you. And both of you, remember that I loved you enough to make sure you'd find your way back to each other, even if I couldn't be there to see it." When Richard finished reading, neither he nor Tommy spoke for a long time. The letter had transformed their understanding of Sarah. She hadn't been a passive victim of circumstance, but an active architect of their eventual reunion, planting seeds of reconciliation even as she faced her own mortality. "She knew," Tommy said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew we'd find each other." Richard nodded, carefully folding the letter. "She made sure of it. Even at the end, she was thinking of us, believing in us." The knowledge that Sarah had forgiven, had understood, had planned for their reunion, even in her final days, changed everything. It wasn't just a letter, it was a map, guiding them toward healing they hadn't known was possible. The deeper truth about Richard's desperate attempts to find Sarah and Tommy emerged gradually, pieced together from old investigator reports, credit card statements, and Richard's personal journals. The evidence painted a picture of a man fighting against invisible barriers, never realizing his own father was the architect of his failure. Journal entries from the months after Sarah left revealed Richard's initial attempts to contact her. He had gone to her apartment only to find it empty, visited the diner where she worked to learn she'd quit, and even hired his first private investigator, all while James Hawthorne's network systematically erased their traces. Went to the university today, one entry read. Her scholarship was cancelled months ago, no forwarding address. It's like she vanished. What Richard hadn't known was that his father's influence had ensured the university staff would provide no information. The credit card statements told their own story: payments to multiple investigation agencies, travel expenses to different cities following false leads, donations to organizations that helped single mothers, all in hopes of finding some trace of Sarah. Each attempt had been quietly neutralized by James's careful manipulation. I found evidence of at least 20 separate investigations, Tommy said, reviewing the documents. You never stopped looking. His voice held a mixture of wonder and pain. Wonder at his father's persistence, pain at how close they had come to finding each other so many times. One investigator had actually located Sarah during her early pregnancy. The report, intercepted by James, included a photo of her leaving a prenatal clinic. Richard had been sent on a business trip to London that same week, orchestrated by his father to ensure he'd miss this crucial lead. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of letters Richard had written to Sarah during Tommy's childhood. Never sent, they detailed his growing success in business, his empty personal life, and his constant search for her. The world keeps telling me to move on, one letter read, but how do you move on from the other half of your heart? Bank records showed regular deposits to a separate account, money Richard had been setting aside for Sarah if he found her. By the time of her death, the account had grown substantial enough to have changed their lives. I wanted to give her everything I should have had the courage to give her from the start, Richard explained quietly. The investigation that came closest to success happened just months before Sarah's death. A detective had traced her to the hospital where she was receiving treatment. Richard had been in the same building, visiting a business associate, on the very day she wrote her final letter. They had been mere floors apart, neither knowing the other was so close. Look at this, Tommy said, holding up a newspaper clipping. It was an advertisement Richard had placed in multiple cities. Sarah E. I was wrong. Please let me make it right. James had ensured similar ads were placed for other Sarah E. dots, burying the real message in a sea of decoys. The evidence of Richard's search extended beyond Sarah's death. He had hired specialists to trace Tommy through the foster care system, unaware that his father's influence was still actively hiding the boy's whereabouts. Each Christmas and birthday, Richard had added to the account meant for Sarah, now designated for their child if he ever found them. I never stopped, Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. Not for a single day. I just never realized I was fighting an invisible war against my own father. Tommy sat silent for a long moment, absorbing this new understanding of the past. All the years he'd spent feeling abandoned, his father had been searching. All the times he'd cursed Richard's name, the man had been trying to find him. She would have forgiven you, Tommy said finally. Mom, if she'd known how hard you tried. Richard touched Sarah's photograph gently. She did know, he replied. Somehow she knew. That's why she left us the clues, the letters. She understood what I was too blind to see, that sometimes love has to take the long way home. The path to true understanding and reconciliation began on the day Tommy and Richard decided to follow Sarah's trail of hidden letters. Starting at the old diner where his parents first met, now a trendy cafe, they found the first letter tucked behind a loose brick in the alley, Sarah's favorite spot for breaks during her long shifts. I knew you'd both come here eventually, Sarah's words read. This is where our story began, Richard, where you saw past my waitress uniform to the person beneath. Tommy, this is where your father first showed the heart that would lead him back to you. Each location held not just a letter, but a piece of their shared history. In the park where Richard and Sarah had spent countless afternoons, they found photographs and a pressed flower from their first date. At the church where they'd planned to marry, a letter describes Sarah's dreams for their future, dreams that included Tommy even before he existed. The most powerful moment came at their final stop, the hospital where Sarah had spent her last days. In a hidden corner of the chapel, they found her most intimate letter, written hours before her death. "Love isn't always straightforward," she wrote. "Sometimes it gets twisted by fear, pride, or circumstance. But true love, like water, always finds its way through the cracks." As they read each letter together, the walls between father and son began to crumble. Tommy saw his father not as the wealthy businessman who had abandoned them, but as the young man who had loved his mother deeply and fought to find them. Richard saw in Tommy not just the son he'd lost, but Sarah's incredible legacy of strength and forgiveness. "She never gave up on either of us," Tommy realized, reading through the letters again in Richard's study. "Even when everything seemed hopeless, she believed we'd find our way back to each other." Richard nodded, touching the photograph on his desk. "Your mother understood something I'm only now beginning to grasp, that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to try, to forgive, to begin again." The reconciliation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Too much had happened for that, but Sarah's letters provided a foundation for understanding. They showed both men that their pain, their mistakes, and their journey back to each other had been part of a larger story, one written in the language of love and forgiveness. One evening, as they added Sarah's letters to the memory box they now shared, Tommy turned to his father. "Mom used to say that understanding comes when you're ready for it," he said. "I think I finally understand what she meant." Richard met his son's eyes, seeing in them the same wisdom that had drawn him to Sarah all those years ago. What did she mean? "That sometimes things fall apart so they can come back together stronger," Tommy replied. "Like us." The understanding between them now went deeper than DNA, deeper than shared loss or rediscovered connection. It was built on Sarah's legacy of love, on their own hard-won wisdom, and on the recognition that reconciliation isn't about erasing the past, it's about building a future that honors it. As they sat in the study that evening, surrounded by Sarah's letters and their shared memories, both father and son felt her presence more strongly than ever. She had designed this reconciliation like a master architect, laying the foundation even as she prepared to leave them. Through her words, her love, and her unwavering faith in both of them, she had built a bridge across the years of separation. The idea for Sarah's foundation was born during a late-night conversation between Tommy and Richard as they reviewed more files documenting how corporate policies had affected families like the Andersons. Rather than dwelling on past mistakes, they decided to create something that would embody Sarah's spirit of love and support for those in need. "Mum always said that real change happens one person at a time," Tommy explained, sketching out his vision. "We need something that doesn't just throw money at problems, but actually helps people the way she would have." The Sarah Evans Foundation launched with 3 main initiatives. The first, inspired directly by Sarah's story, provided support for single parents pursuing education while raising children. The program offered not just financial assistance, but also practical help, childcare, mentoring, and flexible study options. The second initiative, drawing from Tommy's experiences, focused on reforming the foster care and adoption systems. Working with the Andersons, who they had finally located and reconciled with, they created programs to support potential adoptive parents who had love and stability to offer, regardless of their income level. "We're not just changing policies," Richard explained at the Foundation's launch event. "We're changing how we measure what makes a good home for a child." Sarah understood that love, commitment, and stability matter more than bank balances. The third initiative, perhaps closest to both their hearts, was a comprehensive support system for homeless youth. Beyond just providing shelter and food, the program offered education, job training, mental health support, and most importantly, a path to stability that didn't require giving up their dignity or identity. The foundation's headquarters was established in the renovated diner where Sarah and Richard first met. The building maintained its original character while housing modern facilities for education and support services. Sarah's photograph hung in the entrance, her warm smile welcoming everyone who entered. Tommy took an active role in running the foundation, bringing his unique perspective to every decision. His street experiences proved invaluable in designing programs that would actually work for people in need, not just look good on paper. My mother taught me that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life, Tommy told reporters at the opening ceremony. But sometimes people need more than just a chance. They need someone to believe in them, to stand by them while they find their way. Richard, watching his son address the crowd, saw Sarah in every gesture, every passionate word. The foundation became their way of honoring her legacy while healing their own wounds. Each life they touched, each family they helped keep together, felt like a tribute to the woman who had never lost faith in love's power to transform lives. The foundation's first year exceeded all expectations. Dozens of single parents completed their education, numerous children found permanent homes with loving families who might have been overlooked by traditional metrics, and hundreds of homeless youth found paths to stability and growth. But perhaps the most meaningful success came in the small moments when a young single mother graduated from college, her child watching proudly when a former street kid returned as a volunteer mentor when families torn apart by poverty found their way back together with the foundation's help. "This is how we make it right," Tommy said one evening, reviewing success stories with his father. "Not by erasing the past, but by using what we learned from it to help others." Richard nodded, touching the small photograph of Sarah he now kept on his desk. "She would have loved this," he said softly. Using business resources to support the kind of personal, hands-on help she always believed in. The Sarah Evans Foundation became more than just a charitable organization. It became a living testament to Sarah's belief that love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform any life. Through it, Tommy and Richard found not just a way to honor Sarah's memory, but a shared purpose that strengthened their own healing bond. The connection to Tommy's past came full circle on a snowy December morning, 5 years after his reunion with Richard. During a routine visit to one of the foundation's medical clinics, a young doctor caught his attention. There was something familiar about her determined stance, about the way she interacted with homeless patients with such understanding and respect. "Tommy Evans," she called out as he was leaving. "I wasn't sure at first, but it has to be you." She stepped forward, and suddenly Tommy was transported back to that cold night in the abandoned warehouse. "I'm Emily Carter. You saved my life when I was 8 years old." The recognition hit him like a physical force. The terrified little girl he'd protected from abuse had grown into a confident young woman, her white coat a symbol of how far she'd come from that desperate night. "After you intervened," Emily explained over coffee, "I was placed with a foster family who actually cared. They adopted me the following year." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping about the incident, carefully preserved. "I never knew your name until I saw you in the news with your father. I've been hoping to find you ever since." Emily had followed Tommy's story in the media, but had waited until now to make contact, wanting to establish herself first. She had graduated medical school at the top of her class, specializing in pediatric trauma care. Her experiences had driven her to help other children who had faced similar situations. "That night changed everything for me," she said. "Not just because you stopped him, but because you showed me that someone cared enough to help a stranger. It gave me hope when I needed it most." Richard, upon hearing about the reunion, was deeply moved by this testament to his son's character. "Even when you had nothing," he told Tommy, "you were still your mother's son, protecting others at your own risk." Emily joined the foundation's medical team, bringing both her professional skills and personal understanding to their work with traumatized youth. She and Tommy developed a strong friendship, their shared past creating a unique bond of understanding. During one of their conversations, Emily revealed something that brought tears to Tommy's eyes. I kept track of that warehouse for years, she said. Left food and supplies there when I could, hoping to help other kids like you helped me. It was my way of paying it forward until I could do more. The revelation that his single act of courage had created such lasting ripples of positive change affected Tommy profoundly. It reinforced his belief in the Foundation's mission and the importance of individual actions in changing lives. Together, Tommy and Emily developed a new program within the Foundation, focusing specifically on providing medical care and support to children escaping abuse. They named it Sarah's Angels, in honor of Tommy's mother, whose spirit of protection and love had lived on through her son's actions that night. "Your mother would be so proud," Richard said, watching Tommy and Emily present their program to the Foundation's board. She always believed that one person could make a difference in the world. Emily's presence in their lives became a powerful reminder that no act of kindness, no matter how small it might seem at the time, is ever wasted. Her success story inspired others in the Foundation's programs, showing them that trauma and hardship didn't have to define their futures. Sometimes, Tommy reflected, looking at the old newspaper clipping Emily had kept, we don't realize how far the ripples of our actions will spread. He touched his mother's photograph in his pocket, a gesture that had become almost unconscious over the years. Mom used to say that love was like throwing a stone in a pond. You might not see all the ripples, but they're there. The reunion with Emily brought their story full circle, proving that even in the darkest moments of his life, Tommy had carried forward his mother's legacy of love and courage. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the people we help return to help us understand the true impact of our choices. 10 years after Tommy and Richard's chance encounter on that cold city street, they stood together at Sarah's grave on a bright spring morning. The marble headstone, now surrounded by flowering plants they regularly maintained, bore a new inscription: love finds a way through time, through pain, through healing. The Sarah Evans Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, helping thousands of families and children find their way to better lives. But more importantly, father and son had finally found their own path to healing, guided by Sarah's enduring love and wisdom. "I think she knew," Tommy said, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. Even at the end, she knew everything would somehow work out. He touched the worn photograph in his pocket, his constant connection to her through all these years. Richard nodded, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "Your mother saw possibilities where others saw only problems. She understood that love was stronger than any obstacle. Even time itself, the years had softened his features, grief and guilt gradually replaced by peace and purpose." The Foundation's latest project was perhaps their most meaningful, a comprehensive support center built on the site of the abandoned warehouse where Tommy had once sought shelter. The building, modern and welcoming, housed medical facilities staffed by Emily, educational spaces, and support services for struggling families. Full circle, Tommy mused, thinking of how many lives had been touched, how many families had been helped. The scared, homeless boy he'd once been would never have imagined this future, not just the material success, but the deep sense of purpose and belonging he'd found. Richard had changed too, transformed by love and redemption. The ruthless businessman had given way to a compassionate leader who understood that true wealth lay not in profit margins, but in the lives they could help change. His office walls, once covered in business awards, now displayed photos of families they'd helped, letters of gratitude, drawings from children who'd found hope through their programs. Together, they'd created something that honored Sarah's memory in the most meaningful way possible by continuing her legacy of love, understanding, and unwavering faith in human potential. The Foundation wasn't just an organization, it was a living testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. Mum used to say that everyone deserves a second chance, Tommy said, adjusting the flowers on her grave. She gave us both ours even after she was gone. Richard smiled, remembering Sarah's final letters, the trail of hope she'd left for them to follow. She never lost faith in either of us, he agreed. Even when we'd lost faith in ourselves, As they turned to leave the cemetery, the morning sun caught the gold lettering on the headstone, making it shine. Behind them, Sarah's smile in the photograph seemed to glow with approval, watching over the family she'd never stopped believing in. They walked together toward their waiting car, father and son, their shadows merging in the morning light. The past couldn't be changed, but they had learned to build something beautiful from its ruins. Sarah's love had found a way, just as she'd always believed it would. "Ready for the board meeting?" Richard asked, though they both knew he meant more than just the day's agenda. Tommy nodded, touching the photograph one last time. "Ready," he replied. "We've got work to do, people to help, lives to change." Just as Sarah would have wanted, just as she'd known they would. Their story wasn't just about reconciliation anymore, it was about transformation, about the endless possibilities that open up when love finds its way home. Through Sarah's legacy, they had not only healed their own wounds but had created a way to help others heal theirs. The end was really just another beginning. If this story touched your heart, we'd deeply appreciate your support. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moments resonated with you most? How did Sarah's enduring love and faith impact you? Subscribe to join our community of storytellers and story lovers, and share this tale of redemption with friends and family who might need its message of hope. Your likes and engagement help us continue creating meaningful content that reminds us all that love truly finds a way. Together, let's spread more stories that celebrate the power of forgiveness, second chances, and unconditional love.